You are standing in a field. It is early morning. The sun has been up for maybe an hour, and the light is that particular pale gold of autumn in northern France. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you are not about to fight for your life in them. The grass is wet with dew. Your boots are already soaked through. You have been standing here since before dawn, and your legs ache, and your back aches, and the armor you are wearing, which weighs somewhere between 15 and 25 kilograms, depending on your rank and your budget, has been pressing on your shoulders since you put it on in the dark 2 hours ago. Around you, several thousand men are doing more or less what you are doing, standing in a field, waiting, being cold and wet and tired and frightened, and trying not to show any of these things because showing them would be bad for the men around you, and because you have been trained since childhood to project a specific quality that your culture calls either courage or honor, or simply not visibly panicking. And this training is currently being tested more severely than it has ever been tested before. Somewhere on the other side of this field, perhaps half a mile away, perhaps closer, it's difficult to judge across the morning mist. Another several thousand men are doing exactly the same thing. They are cold, they are tired, they are frightened. They have been standing since before dawn as well, and in approximately 1 to 3 hours, depending on when the commanders on both sides decide that the moment is right, you're all going to walk toward each other and attempt to kill each other with an assortment of metal implements. This is a medieval battle, not the medieval battle of popular entertainment, not the cinematic sweep of 10,000 extras on a New Zealand hillside, not the choreographed sword duel between charismatic protagonists, not the stylized ballet of gleaming knights on magnificent horses that fills the popular imagination whenever the words medieval and battle appear in sequence. The real thing, the actual documented, deeply human, frequently terrifying, occasionally tedious, sometimes darkly comic reality of what it meant to be a participant in organized violence in medieval Europe. And here is what most people get wrong about it. The medieval battle was not primarily about the dramatic central clash, the moment of maximum violence when two armies collided. It was primarily about everything that surrounded that moment. The logistics and the politics and the psychology and the specific social dynamics that determined whether a battle happened at all, and what happened before and after the fighting, and what the fighting itself actually looked and smelled and sounded like for the people doing it. Because here's the thing about medieval battles that the movies consistently failed to show you. They were mostly not fought by heroes. They were fought by ordinary people who were cold and tired and frightened, who had been marching for weeks before the battle and would need to march for weeks after it if they survived, who were motivated less by glory and more by loyalty to the Lord they owed service to, or by the wages they had been promised, or by the specific social pressures of a military culture in which visible courage was the primary currency of masculine reputation. They were fought by people who smelled terrible and had blisters on their feet and hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and whose equipment was partly borrowed and partly broken and partly not quite fitting, because the man it was made for had sold it to them after a previous battle had convinced him that there were better ways to earn a living. They were fought by people who were, in other words, human. This is the story of those people, and it begins not on the battlefield, but several weeks before, in the specific reality of medieval military logistics that nobody ever makes a film about, but that determined the outcome of medieval warfare far more reliably than any clash of arms. Chapter 1. The March. Getting there was half the battle. You have been walking for 11 days. Your army assembled in the medieval sense of assembly, which was a process considerably more chaotic than the word implies. approximately 3 weeks ago, at the designated muster point that the Lord's summons specified. The summons itself arrived at your village perhaps 2 weeks before that, carried by a messenger who read it aloud in the village square because most of the people it was addressed to could not read it themselves, and who left behind a written copy that the parish priest would interpret for anyone who needed clarification about the specific obligations being invoked. The summons called out the feudal levy, the military service that you owe to your lord in exchange for the land tenure that supports your family, depending on your specific land holding. This service might be 40 days per year, the standard English feudal obligation, or some different number negotiated at the establishment of your tenure. The 40-day limit matters enormously in the economics of medieval warfare. A lord planning a campaign had to either complete his objectives within that window or find alternative means of keeping his army in the field, which meant paying wages, which meant finding money, which meant the campaign was now also a financial crisis. The muster was theoretically an impressive display of military force. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare of arriving groups at different times from different directions, each with their own equipment, their own servants, their own supply problems, their own ideas about how much space they were entitled to in the camp, and their own expectations about when they would be fed and by whom. Your group, the contingent from your lord's lands, arrived on the 3rd day, which meant you had been at the muster point for 2 days longer than some contingents and 4 days less than others, and the resulting order of march, when the army finally moved out, was determined by a combination of military logic and social hierarchy that satisfied nobody completely and irritated almost everybody. The army on the march was not the gleaming column of armored warriors that popular imagination produces. It was a long, strung-out, gradually disintegrating procession that stretched, on a normal March day, over perhaps 10 to 15 miles of road, with the fighting men at the front, the supply wagons in the middle, and the inevitable camp followers at the rear. The camp followers were numerous and essential. The servants who managed equipment, the sutlers who sold food and drink, the smiths who repaired weapons and horseshoes, the surgeons who were more accurately described as wound dressers, the priests who provided spiritual comfort and administrative services, and the assorted other people who attached themselves to armies for reasons ranging from commercial opportunity to personal loyalty to the simple fact that armies moved through the landscape, and occasionally the safest place to be was with an army rather than in its path. The daily march covered approximately 15 to 20 miles on a good day, on a good road, in good weather, with a well-organized army. None of these conditions applied consistently. Medieval roads ranged from the reasonably maintained Roman roads that still crossed much of Western Europe to the barely navigable cart tracks of the rural interior, and an army of several thousand people plus their supply train moving along the same route in sequence could reduce even a reasonable road to a mud-churned disaster within hours of the first units passing through. The supply problem was, from the very beginning of the campaign, the dominant practical reality. A medieval army of 5,000 men needed to consume approximately 5,000 to 10,000 pounds of food per day, the specific number depending on the proportion of cavalry, whose horses added enormous feeding requirements, and the availability of local forage. This food came from 3 sources: supplies carried with the army, food purchased or requisitioned from the local population along the march route, and food seized from the local population by whatever means were available. The last option, called in medieval military terminology by the charmingly bureaucratic word purveyance when done in a controlled way, or simply plunder when done in the less controlled way that it usually was was simultaneously the most practically effective method of supply and the one most corrosive to strategic objectives. An army that systematically stripped the countryside of food had, in the immediate term, solved its supply problem. In the medium term, it had created an enemy out of every local inhabitant who had just watched their harvest taken, had potentially denied itself the logistical support of a population that might otherwise have been neutral or cooperative, and had contributed to the devastation of the agricultural base, whose surplus it needed to exploit. Medieval commanders understood this. They issued orders, with some regularity, against unauthorized plunder. The orders were, with some regularity, ignored by soldiers whose alternative was going hungry, whose commander's practical capacity to enforce the orders was limited, and whose sense of the distinction between legitimate requisition and unauthorized seizure was flexible in proportion to their hunger. The physical experience of the march was one of the least romantic aspects of medieval warfare, and one of the most formative. By the time the army arrived at the location where a battle might be fought, it had been marching for days or weeks, eating inconsistently, sleeping in the open or in makeshift camps, wearing equipment that had been repaired multiple times and fit imperfectly, and accumulating the specific wear and tiredness that the history books never quite capture, because the history books are mostly written about what happened in the battle, not about the 11 days of walking that came before it. You arrived, in other words, in the condition of someone who has been camping without adequate facilities for almost 2 weeks, which is not the condition in which most people perform at their best. Chapter 2. The Camp. The Night Before. Let's talk about the camp. The night before a battle, an army camped in the field in conditions that ranged from the Spartan to the catastrophic, depending on the logistics situation and the weather, and the specific competence of the quartermaster arrangements. Medieval military camp organization was a subject that military theorists addressed in their treatises, and that field commanders addressed in their orders, and that individual soldiers addressed by finding the least muddy patch of ground available and lying down on it. The aristocratic element of the army, the knights and lords and their immediate retinues, had tents. Specific, recognizable tents, marked with the heraldic identification of their occupants, supplied with furniture and equipment that had been transported in wagons specifically dedicated to this purpose. The medieval noble, on campaign, did not sleep in the open if he could avoid it, and his domestic arrangements in camp were the mobile version of his domestic arrangements at home, heated by a brazier when weather required it, furnished with a folding bed, and camp furniture supplied by his household staff, who had been traveling with the army specifically to maintain these standards. The ordinary soldiers, the foot soldiers, the archers, the minor men-at-arms without the wealth or status to maintain extensive personal equipment, made do. They slept in their cloaks on the ground, or under the wagons if rain made shelter necessary, or in improvised shelters constructed from whatever materials were available. They ate what was provided or what they could find. In a well-organized campaign with functioning supply arrangements, this meant adequate, if monotonous, rations. In a poorly organized campaign in hostile territory, which was the more common situation, it meant whatever they could get. The fires are worth thinking about specifically. Fires were essential in camp, for warmth, for cooking, for the specific morale function of a fire, around which people could gather and talk, and maintain the social fabric of their unit. The visible fires of an enemy camp at night were also, of course, military intelligence, indicating the position, approximate size, and approximate to organization of the opposing force. The specific decision of whether to allow fires in camp the night before, A battle involved a calculation between the morale cost of keeping cold men in the dark and the tactical cost of broadcasting your exact position to the enemy. Different commanders in different situations made different decisions. The psychological state of a medieval army, the night before a battle, is one of the most interesting and most underexplored aspects of the medieval military experience. The academic study of combat psychology is largely a modern field, developed from the experience of 20th century industrial warfare with its specific combinations of mass casualties, prolonged exposure to danger, and institutional management of combat stress. Medieval warfare had none of the institutional frameworks that modern armies have developed for managing the psychological impact of combat. No counseling services, no rotation policies, no institutional recognition of combat stress as a medical condition. What it had instead was a set of cultural, social, and religious practices that served the same function, not by treating combat stress explicitly, but by embedding the combat experience in frameworks of meaning and social solidarity that made it bearable. The religious practice of the night before battle was one of these frameworks. Medieval armies in the days before an engagement typically provided access to confession and communion, the specific sacramental services that, in Catholic theology, prepared a person for death by reconciling them with God and ensuring that mortal sin would not prevent them from achieving salvation if they died the following day. The availability of this service was not merely comforting in the abstract sense. It was pragmatically important in a culture where the fear of what happened to the unshriven soul after death was a genuine and specific anxiety. The specific prayers said before battle, by individuals, by chaplains, over assembled groups, by the commanders who were responsible for the spiritual as well as the physical welfare of their forces, were not merely ritual. They were an assertion that the violence about to be committed was legitimate, authorized by God and King, and that the deaths that would result were not murders, but honorable casualties in a just cause. The theology of the just war, developed by Augustine and elaborated by medieval scholastic thinkers, provided the conceptual framework within which medieval warriors understood their own violence. This framework was not merely convenient rationalization. It was a genuine moral system that distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate violence, between the killing done in a just war and the killing done in a private quarrel, and that provided medieval combatants with a specific moral context for what they were about to do. The social framework of the battle. Eve was equally important. The specific unit cohesions of medieval armies, the lord's retinue, the town militia, the mercenary company, were tightly knit social groups whose solidarity provided the primary psychological support for their individual members. Men going into battle with men they knew, whose families they knew, whose communities they shared, were fighting in the company of people for whom they felt genuine responsibility and from whom they could expect genuine support. This social solidarity was not a given. It had to be maintained and reinforced, and the eve of battle was one of the primary occasions for that maintenance. The feasting and drinking that sometimes accompanied the night before battle served this function, among others. The communal meal, even if the meal was modest, even if the drink was more ale than wine, created the shared experience of eating together that is one of the most fundamental human solidarity behaviors. The stories told around the fires, the songs sung, the specific rituals of courage and loyalty performed in the company of comrades. These were the medieval equivalent of the unit cohesion activities that modern military psychology explicitly recognizes as critical to combat performance. The drinking, it should be said, could get out of hand. The historical record contains several instances of armies that arrived at the morning of battle in a state significantly less optimal than ideal due to the previous night's fortification of morale. The chronicler who recorded that the French knights at Crécy in 1346 were not in the finest possible condition when they made their attack on the English position. After a march from Abbeville, arriving at dusk, conducting preliminary skirmishing into the evening, was noting a specific military incompetence. But the impulse that drove men to drink heavily the night before they might die was at least understandable. Chapter 3. The morning. Preparation for combat. You wake up before dawn. This is not by choice. This is because someone has been shaking you awake, and the voice doing the shaking is using the specific tone of someone who has been awake for 2 hours already and has had enough of dealing with people who aren't. The army is moving to its battle position, and moving to a battle position requires doing approximately everything simultaneously: eating whatever is available for breakfast, checking and rechecking equipment, receiving instructions about the order of march and the intended battle formation, managing the horses if you are mounted, managing the anxiety that has been building since the previous evening, and that is now, in the cold gray of pre-dawn, considerably more acute. The preparation of a medieval soldier for battle was a process that took considerably longer than popular entertainment suggests. The arming of a knight, the specific sequence of putting on the full plate armor that characterized the better equipped cavalry of the 14th and 15th centuries, was a multi-stage process requiring assistance, taking potentially 30 to 45 minutes, and resulting in a state of readiness that was physically demanding to maintain for extended periods. Let's go through it, because the details matter for understanding what combat in this equipment actually felt like. The foundation layer was the arming doublet, a padded garment, quilted and fitted, that served as the base on which armor was attached, and as padding against the blows that the armor would receive. This garment had specific points, laces or hooks, at precisely calculated positions for attaching the various pieces of plate armor. Putting on the arming doublet correctly was itself a process requiring attention, because improperly placed attachment points would mean improperly fitted armor, which would mean either restricted movement or inadequate protection. Over the arming doublet went the armor proper, in a specific sequence from feet to head. Sabatons for the feet, greaves for the lower leg, polans for the knee, cuisses for the thigh. A fold of overlapping plates protecting the hips and lower abdomen, a breastplate and back plate, reary braces for the upper arm, coutures for the elbow, vambrasses for the lower arm, gauntlets for the hands, and finally, the most important piece, the piece that everything else was designed to protect toward, the helmet. The 15th century knight in full plate armor was encased in approximately 15 to 25 kilograms of carefully shaped steel, less than popular imagination suggests, because the weight was distributed across the whole body rather than concentrated in a few pieces, and because the specific design of the joints allowed significant freedom of movement. A man in full plate armor of good quality could run, could mount a horse without assistance, could perform the full range of combat movements required of mounted and dismounted fighting. The popular image of knights being lifted onto horses by cranes is a myth, an entertaining one, but thoroughly debunked by the evidence of contemporary accounts, period artwork, and the direct experimental evidence of people who have actually worn replicas and tested their mobility. That said, wearing 20 kilograms of steel in combat is not the same as not wearing it. The weight has a cumulative effect. Extended combat in full plate generates heat. The steel conducts body heat away initially, but retains it after warming, and the interior temperature of a suit of plate armor in intense physical activity can become genuinely dangerous. Medieval accounts of knights dying from heat exhaustion in armor are not apocryphal. The specific physiological demands of armored combat, the weight management, the thermoregulation, the restricted breathing through a visor that limits airflow, were challenges that armored combatants managed through specific fitness conditioning, specific water and rest management, and the specific experience of knowing their own limitations. The less wealthy soldiers, the foot soldiers, the archers, the minor men-at-arms, were armed more modestly and prepared more quickly. The English longbowman, who was the decisive military instrument of the major English victories of the Hundred Years' War, wore little more than a padded gambeson, perhaps with additional metal protection at the arms or chest, and a steel helmet of some form. His primary equipment was the longbow itself, the 6-foot self-bow of English yew that was both a formidable weapon and a specific physical challenge requiring years of training to use effectively. The longbowman's equipment included 24 arrows in the quiver, 1 sheath, the standard battlefield allocation, and perhaps additional arrows in sheaves carried in a bundled reserve. His ability to deliver approximately 12 aimed arrows per minute, sustained over extended periods, was the product of years of compulsory practice mandated by English law, specifically to maintain the trained archer population that English military strategy depended on. The specific physical deformation visible in the skeletal remains of medieval archers, overdevelopment of the left shoulder and arm from the sustained tension of the draw, stress fractures in the spine and left wrist, is archaeological evidence of the specific physical demands of developing and maintaining this skill. The formation of the battle line was the final preparatory act before combat. Medieval battle formations were more organized than popular imagination tends to suggest, though less rigid than the drill formation discipline of early modern or modern armies. The basic tactical unit was the battle or division, a group of several hundred to a few thousand men, organized loosely into formations by function: mounted knights, dismounted men-at-arms, archers, spearmen, and by social and administrative unit: lord's retinue, town contingent, mercenary company. The placement of these units relative to each other, the specific battle array, was a deliberate tactical decision reflecting the commander's assessment of the terrain, the enemy's likely dispositions, and the specific capabilities of the available troops. The English preferred, particularly in the 100 Years' War, a defensive arrangement with dismounted men-at-arms, flanked by archers in echelon or on the wings, positioned to maximize the crossfire that the archers could bring on any approaching formation. The French preferred, or at least frequently employed, a more aggressive approach that prioritized the shock action of mounted knights, an approach that worked brilliantly against infantry without effective projectile weapons, and catastrophically against well-positioned English archers. Chapter 4. The Waiting. The longest hours. The armies are arrayed. The formations are set. The commanders have made their decisions, or at least the decisions that could be made in advance, because the actual management of a medieval battle, once started, involved decisions made in real time with incomplete information under conditions of stress that would challenge the cognitive performance of any human being. And now you wait. The waiting before a medieval battle is one of its most underrepresented aspects, and one of its most psychologically significant. The gap between the completion of preparation and the beginning of combat was not, in most cases, measured in minutes. It was measured in hours. Medieval battles were typically preceded by extended periods in which both armies occupied their positions, assessed the situation, and waited for something. The right moment, the enemy's first move, the outcome of whatever negotiations might still be possible, the arrival of additional troops, the shift in weather, the specific psychological crack in the enemy's composure that might trigger a panic before the fighting even began. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the battle that ended the Plantagenet dynasty and the Wars of the Roses simultaneously, was preceded by a period in which both armies faced each other across the field for several hours, while the Stanley family's forces watched from a hill and declined to commit to either side, waiting to determine which way the battle would go before joining it. The specific tension of that waiting, Richard III, knowing that the Stanleys could decide his fate, but were deliberately withholding their decision, is one of the most dramatic examples of the waiting period's potential for psychological and tactical complexity. The waiting was managed by experienced soldiers through a combination of practical activity and deliberate mental discipline. Experienced men checked their equipment again, not because it needed checking, but because having something to do with their hands was preferable to standing still with their thoughts. They talked to the men beside them in the formation, not necessarily about the battle, not necessarily about anything significant, because sometimes the most important thing about a conversation in the hour before combat is simply that it is a conversation, a confirmation that other people are here, that you are not alone in this. They also, if the chronicles are to be believed, engaged in a considerable amount of posturing. Medieval warfare had a theatrical dimension, a deliberate performance of martial identity that served both morale and intimidation functions. The shouting of war cries, the display of banners and heraldic identification, the specific challenges issued from one army to another, the individual knight who rode out in front of his army to offer personal combat to any champion of the opposing force. These theatrical elements were not merely decoration. They were part of the psychological management of the battle situation, the deliberate performance of confidence and martial virtue that maintained the morale of one's own side while attempting to undermine the composure of the other. The heraldic system that characterized the visual culture of medieval warfare served this function among others. The banners, surcoats, and painted shields that identified individual knights and their lords were not mere vanity. They were communication technology, the visual system that allowed commanders to identify the positions of specific units on a battlefield, obscured by dust and confusion, that allowed soldiers to orient themselves toward their lord's banner as a rallying point, and that created the specific social accountability of the battlefield. The knight whose banner was seen fleeing the field was identified. The knight who performed conspicuously in combat was observed. The medieval battle was a social event in which reputation was made and destroyed in visible, documented ways. The heralds, the specific officials responsible for heraldic identification and the management of certain battlefield protocols, occupied a role in medieval warfare that was itself a fascinating combination of the practical and the ceremonial. Heralds from opposing armies could pass between the battle lines under conventions of safe conduct. They could carry messages between commanders, negotiate the terms of surrender, arrange the exchange of prisoners, and manage the formal conventions that govern the conduct of warfare between recognized participants in the chivalric system. The existence of these conventions, the rules that governed certain behaviors in medieval warfare, is one of the most frequently misunderstood aspects of the medieval battle. Popular history often presents medieval warfare as entirely without rules, a pure exercise in violence, constrained only by physical capability. The reality was more complicated. There were genuine conventions governing the treatment of prisoners, the protocols of surrender, the immunity of certain categories of non-combatants, and the management of the aftermath of battle, and these conventions were sometimes respected and sometimes not, in patterns that reflected the specific circumstances of the conflict and the specific cultures and motivations of the participants. The taking of prisoners rather than killing defeated opponents was not, as it is sometimes presented, simply a humanitarian impulse. It was a financial system. A captured knight or nobleman was worth a ransom, a payment by the prisoner's family and lord for their return. And the management of ransom was one of the most economically significant aspects of medieval warfare for the combatants who participated in it. The English archers who captured French knights at Agincourt in 1415 were not simply being kind. They were acquiring assets. The subsequent order by Henry V to kill the prisoners, given in circumstances where the battle's outcome was suddenly threatened, was not merely strategically controversial. It was financially devastating for the men who had to carry it out, because they were destroying the prisoners they had acquired at some personal risk. Chapter 5. The Advance, the Longest Walk. The signal comes. In the medieval battle, the signal to advance was typically visual or audible, or both. The lowering of a banner, the sound of a trumpet, the shout of a command passed along the battle line by a chain of officers whose ability to be heard over the ambient noise of thousands of armored men making the specific sounds that armored men make was limited and crucial. And then the army moved. The specific physical experience of a medieval advance, of thousands of men beginning to move forward across the ground between the two armies, was unlike anything most modern people have experienced or can easily imagine. The sound alone was extraordinary. The rhythmic clank and clatter of metal on metal and metal on leather, multiplied by the thousands, the sound of thousands of boots on varying surfaces, the voices of commanders maintaining the line, the specific sound of war horses beginning to move that is different in quality and quantity from anything a pedestrian experience of horses provides. The advance was not a charge, not at the beginning, not for most of the distance. Medieval armies, particularly infantry armies, advanced at a walking pace, maintaining formation, preserving the energy of the men for the combat that waited at the end of the advance. The specific tactical choice of when to transition from walk to run, the decision about when the psychological and physical momentum of a charge would outweigh the cost in energy and formation coherence, was one of the judgment calls the commanders and experienced soldiers made in real time, based on the distance remaining, the enemy's reaction, the ground between them, and dozens of other factors. The English longbowmen, who were the instrument of English tactical success in the 100 Years' War, typically did not advance at all. They were positioned defensively, often in prepared positions reinforced with stakes driven into the ground at angles to impede cavalry charges, and they opened fire at ranges that began with a well-drawn longbow and favorable wind at 200 to 300 meters and continued until the enemy was close enough that the angle and the crowd made aiming at individuals rather than formations necessary. The effect of massed longbow fire on an approaching formation is one of the things that modern reconstruction experiments have done most to clarify, because the documentary sources, while vivid, do not always provide the specific quantitative information that makes the tactical picture fully clear. An English longbow, drawn to the ear by a trained archer, could shoot a heavy broadhead arrow with enough force to penetrate most period mail armor at ranges up to 100 meters and to cause serious injury through plate armor at short range. The more important tactical effect, however, was not on the armored knights at the front of a charging formation, but on the horses. Horses are not armored, or were not fully armored in most period contexts, and a horse hit by a cloth-yard arrow at any range is going to have problems. A horse killed or seriously wounded in the middle of a cavalry charge creates a specific cascading tactical problem. The horse falls, throwing its rider, potentially falling on the rider, creating an obstacle for the horses behind it, causing them to shear away or slow or fall themselves, disrupting the formation, creating the specific confusion that English commanders in the 100 Years' War repeatedly exploited. The psychological dimension of advancing under arrow fire should not be underestimated. The specific experience of being in a formation that is being shot at, knowing that arrows are landing around you, that men near you are being hit, that the next arrow might be the one that finds you, while continuing to move forward in good order toward the source of the fire, is a specific psychological challenge that distinguishes experienced soldiers from inexperienced ones, and that medieval commanders addressed through a combination of training, leadership, and the specific social pressure of mutual observation. Not moving forward under fire in a medieval army was not simply a tactical problem. It was a social and moral failure, visible to everyone around you, with permanent consequences for your reputation in a culture where military reputation was one of the primary currencies of social standing. The specific peer pressure of the chivalric and military cultures that organized medieval warfare was a powerful motivator for behavior that, in purely individual risk calculus terms, made no sense at all. The French knights at Crécy, who continued to charge the English position through repeated repulses, losing horses and men with each successive wave, until the field was piled with dead horses and the charge had become physically impossible. These men were not simply stupid. They were trapped in a cultural logic that made retreat more costly in social and reputational terms than continuation. The specific catastrophe of Crécy reflects not merely French tactical incompetence, but the specific way in which chivalric culture could override strategic rationality when the two came into conflict. Chapter 6. The Clash. What combat actually felt like you are 50 meters from the enemy formation. This is the moment that every previous hour of your day has been building toward, and the specific physical and psychological reality of it is something that no movie has ever quite captured, because the specific combination of sensory input, physical demand, and cognitive overload that characterizes this moment is not something that can be fully reproduced by an actor in a carefully controlled environment. The noise is extraordinary. The clashing of metal against metal, multiplied by hundreds of simultaneous individual combats, creates a sound that contemporary chroniclers consistently describe as overwhelming, louder than anything they had previously experienced, louder than thunderstorms, louder than anything in the ambient soundscape of the medieval world. This is important tactically as well as experientially. In the middle of the melee, voice commands are essentially inaudible. Communication between commanders and units in the midst of combat was managed through visual signals, banners, the movements of heralds, and through the pre-battle instructions that had been given and hopefully internalized by unit leaders. The smell is something that historical sources rarely describe directly, but that experimental archaeology and the reports of modern military personnel suggest was intense. The iron smell of blood, the specific smell of fear sweat, which is chemically different from exercise sweat, and both parties can detect subconsciously. The smell of disturbed earth, of horse dung on the field, of the burning where artillery or fire arrows had been used, and overlaying all of it, the specific biological intensity of large numbers of human bodies in close physical contact under extreme stress. The visual field was radically restricted. The visor of a closed helmet reduced the field of vision significantly. You could see what was directly in front of you, and with effort, what was to either side. But your peripheral awareness of the broader situation was severely limited. Dust raised by the movements of thousands of men and horses added another layer of visual restriction, and the specific chaos of the melee, the constant movement of individuals and small groups, the falling of men and horses, the shifting of formations as they pushed and were pushed, made it genuinely difficult to maintain any clear picture of the overall battle situation from within it. Medieval combat was therefore, from the participant's perspective, intensely local. Your tactical world was the 10 to 20 feet immediately around you, the men in your immediate unit who were fighting beside you, the opponents immediately in front of you, the specific threat of the man who was trying to hit you right now, the broader strategic situation, whether your side was winning or losing, whether the flanks were holding, whether the cavalry reserve had been committed, was information you did not have and could not easily acquire in the middle of the melee. The specific techniques of medieval armored combat are one of the most extensively researched and most frequently misrepresented aspects of the field. The popular image of medieval sword fighting, two men swinging large, heavy swords at each other in broad, powerful strokes, bears limited relationship to what the historical sources, the surviving fighting manuals, and the experimental evidence indicate about how medieval men-at-arms actually fought. Medieval fighting manuals, the Fechtbücher, or fighting books that survive from the 14th and 15th centuries, associated with masters like Johannes Lichtenauer, Fiore de Liberi, and Hans Tollhofer, describe a system of combat that was sophisticated technically, demanding and explicitly designed for the specific challenges of armored and unarmored fighting. The techniques described include grappling and wrestling, alongside weapon use, the specific techniques of half-swording, gripping the blade with the armored hand to use the sword as a shortened lever for thrusting at armor gaps, and Mordhau, reversing the sword to use the crossguard and pommel as a hammer, and a comprehensive system of footwork, timing, and distance management that bears more relationship to a sophisticated martial art than to the popular image of two people bashing each other. The reason for this sophistication is structural. Against well-fitting plate armor, the broad swinging stroke is largely ineffective. The design of plate armor, the specific curved and angled surfaces that deflect blows, the overlapping plates that cover articulation points, the hardened steel that resists cutting edges, was specifically developed to resist exactly the kind of attack that the uninitiated would expect to be most effective. The fighting techniques described in the manuals are designed around the realities of armored combat, finding the gaps in the armor, using leverage and grappling to control a heavily armored opponent, getting close enough to negate the armor's defensive advantage. The specific areas of vulnerability in plate armor, the visor gaps, the armpit and groin areas where articulation required openings, the back of the knee, were known and targeted by experienced fighters. The fighting manuals include specific techniques for exploiting these vulnerabilities, and the archaeological evidence of injuries on medieval skeletal remains confirms that penetrating wounds to these specific areas were common causes of death in armored combat. The psychological dimension of hand-to-hand combat is one of the areas where modern combat psychology has the most to say about the medieval experience because the fundamental human responses to close-range violence, the adrenaline cascade, the tunnel vision, the suppression of pain, the specific cognitive distortions of extreme stress, are consistent across historical periods, even as the specific cultural context changes. Research on modern combat veterans has established that close-range killing, looking at and touching the person you are killing, has a specific and intense psychological impact that distinguishes it from long-range killing. Medieval combat was predominantly close-range killing. The man you were fighting was close enough to touch. You could see his face, hear his breathing, feel the impact of his attempts to hurt you, and the impact of your attempts to hurt him. The psychological management of this proximity, the specific cognitive and emotional processing that allowed medieval combatants to engage in close-range violence without being paralyzed by it, was accomplished through the specific training and cultural framework that medieval military culture provided. The training was physical. The specific fighting techniques we described above developed through years of practice in tournaments and practice combat, but it was also cultural. The specific narrative framework of chivalry and martial virtue that defined close combat as the highest expression of masculine excellence, that glorified the specific violence of the battlefield as honorable rather than shameful, and that provided the medieval warrior with a cultural identity that embraced rather than recoiled from the realities of what combat involved. Chapter 7. The weapons, what they actually did to human bodies. Let's talk about the weapons. Not in the abstract catalog of implements way that most histories of medieval warfare approach the subject. Here is a sword, here is a poleaxe, here is a mace, each with its romantic name and its artistic rendition from the museum collection. But let's talk about what these weapons were actually designed to do, what they actually did when used against armored and unarmored human bodies, and what the medical and archaeological evidence tells us about the specific physical reality of medieval battlefield injury. Because here's the thing about medieval weapons that the museum display cases consistently failed to communicate. They were tools designed for a specific industrial purpose, which was the efficient incapacitation and killing of human beings in conditions of close physical confrontation. Every aspect of their design, the weight distribution, the edge geometry, the length, the grip, the specific combination of cutting, thrusting, and impact capability, reflected the accumulated learning of centuries of practical experience about what worked and what didn't when you needed to stop a man from continuing to fight. The sword, the weapon most associated in popular culture with medieval combat, was not, by the high medieval period, primarily a battlefield weapon. It was a symbol of aristocratic status, a backup weapon for situations where the primary weapon had been lost or was impractical, and a very effective weapon for specific situations involving either unarmored opponents or the specific close-range techniques of armored combat described in the fighting manuals. But on the medieval battlefield, where the most dangerous opponents were armored men-at-arms, and the most common opponents were groups of infantry who needed to be broken as formations rather than killed as individuals, the sword's edge-based design was a secondary consideration. The pole arms, the family of weapons, mounted on long handles that included the halberd, the bill, the vulge, the glaive, the poleaxe, and their numerous regional and period variations, were the primary infantry weapon of the high and late medieval period, for reasons that become obvious when you consider what a polearm does that a sword does not. A polearm puts distance between you and the man trying to kill you. It gives you reach, the specific mechanical advantage of a longer lever arm, that allows you to generate more force with less muscle, and that keeps the opponent's weapon further from your body while your own weapon reaches him. It is harder to block than a sword because the momentum of a heavier object on a longer lever arm is greater. It is typically equipped with combinations of cutting edge, thrusting point, and hooking projection that allow it to be used in multiple ways against different targets. The hook of the halberd that could pull a mounted knight from his saddle, the spike that could find armor gaps in a thrust, the axe blade that could penetrate plate armor in the right conditions. The specific development of polearm design tracks the specific development of plate armor in a historical arms race that produced by the 15th century weapons of remarkable sophistication for the specific challenge of armored combat. The poleaxe, the top-end pole arm of the 15th century man-at-arms, combined an axe blade for cutting and impact, a top spike for thrusting, a rear spike or hammer for specific applications against armor, and the control features of the haft for grappling. It was designed by people who had spent a great deal of time thinking about the specific problem of fighting armored opponents and who had access to the best materials, technology, and craft knowledge of their era. The impact weapons, the mace, the warhammer, the flail, are perhaps the most honest of medieval battlefield weapons in their design intent because they make no pretense at being anything other than what they are. A mace is a metal weight on a handle designed to transmit impact force through armor to the body underneath. The specific design of the flanged mace, with raised ridges on the head that concentrate the impact force on smaller areas, was developed specifically to address the problem of well-fitted plate armor, whose curved surfaces tend to deflect flat-surfaced impacts. The flanges bite into the armor surface rather than glancing off it, concentrating the force at specific points and transmitting shock to the body underneath. The medical reality of being hit by a mace through plate armor is not that the armor is penetrated. It is that the impact force travels through the armor and causes the specific injuries associated with blunt force trauma, bone fractures, soft tissue damage, concussion, internal bleeding. The armor absorbs some of the energy, but cannot eliminate it. The man inside the armor is subjected to what is effectively a controlled version of being hit by a car. The outer surface is not penetrated, but the force transmitted to the body inside is still sufficient to cause serious injury. The warhammer, particularly the type called in Italian the martello di guerra, a long-handled hammer with a pick on the back, was developed specifically to exploit a weakness in plate armor that flat, impact weapons could not reliably exploit. The pick could punch through plate armor in a way that a flat striking surface could not, creating a penetrating wound through the armor rather than merely transmitting shock through it. The evidence of these weapons on actual human bodies is preserved in the skeletal remains found in medieval mass graves associated with specific documented battles. The Battle of Visby in 1361, a short, brutal engagement in which a Swedish levy was massacred by Danish forces on the island of Gotland, produced a mass grave of approximately 1,185 individuals whose skeletal remains have been extensively studied. The injuries visible in these remains provide a direct and sobering record of medieval battlefield violence. The Visby skeletal analysis found injuries that were concentrated on the lower extremities, legs, feet, ankles, in patterns consistent with foot soldiers whose legs were not fully protected by armor being targeted deliberately by opponents who understood that cutting a man's leg was more efficient than trying to penetrate his torso armor. Approximately 25% of the individuals showed evidence of amputations at or just below the knee. the specific cut made by a weapon at exactly the height that indicated a deliberate targeting of the lower leg of a man whose upper body was at least partially armored. This is not the glorious sword fight of popular entertainment. This is the efficient, brutal, tactically calculated application of violence to the specific vulnerabilities of the human body, conducted by people who had thought carefully about where the body was most vulnerable and what weapons were most effective at exploiting those vulnerabilities. Medieval warfare was not gloriously theatrical violence. It was industrial, efficient, and explicitly designed to be effective at what it was for. The arrows. We cannot discuss medieval battlefield weapons without returning to the arrows, because the physical evidence of English longbow arrows on human bodies is extraordinary and specific. The mass grave at Towton, the site of the largest and most violent battle of the Wars of the Roses in 1461, fought in a snowstorm in Yorkshire, contained skeletal remains showing evidence of arrow injuries that include the specific bone damage caused by bodkin point arrows penetrating skull, mandible, and upper spine. The specific geometry of the wound tracks visible in the Towton bones is consistent with arrows traveling at angles, and velocities that the experimental archery evidence suggests are achievable with well-drawn military longbows. The burn injuries visible in some medieval skeletal assemblages reflect the use of fire weapons, incendiary arrows, burning material thrown or projected against formations, and the accidental or deliberate burning associated with siege warfare. The siege context produced a specific range of injury types distinct from the open field battle context: crushing injuries from falling masonry, burns from incendiary materials, drowning in flooded siege works. The specific medical implications of medieval battlefield wounds led over centuries of experience to a body of military medical knowledge that was more sophisticated than popular history usually credits. Medieval battlefield surgeons, the individuals responsible for wound treatment in medieval armies, were not simply applying prayer and guesswork. They had developed, through extensive empirical experience with the specific injury types that medieval weapons produced, a set of practical wound management techniques that reflected genuine medical knowledge. The extraction of arrows was a specific technical challenge that medieval surgeons had developed specific tools and techniques to address. The arrowhead that had penetrated bone was particularly difficult to extract without causing additional damage. And medieval surgical texts describe specific approaches, including the use of a device called a scoop of Diocles, adapted from classical surgery to protect tissue while the arrowhead was withdrawn. That reflected both knowledge of the problem and practical experience with its management. Wound cleaning, the management of infection through cauterization and the application of various topical preparations, the management of bleeding through specific binding and packing techniques. All of these reflected accumulated practical knowledge that produced, in the hands of experienced practitioners, outcomes that were better than a purely pessimistic modern assessment of medieval medicine would predict. The specific survival rates for different types of medieval battlefield wounds are difficult to determine precisely from the surviving evidence, but the pattern that emerges from the combination of skeletal analysis, chronicle accounts, and medical text suggests that penetrating wounds to the torso and skull were usually fatal without modern surgical intervention. Limb wounds were survivable, but frequently led to amputation and infection. Wounds to the extremities from cutting weapons were survivable with proper treatment in a significant proportion of cases. The men who survived medieval battles often survived with permanent physical impairment, the lost fingers, the healed fractures, the scarring that the skeletal evidence consistently reveals in individuals who survived into middle age. Chapter 8. The Cavalry. horses, knights, and the reality of the charge. Let's address the cavalry charge, because it is possibly the most romanticized and most consistently misrepresented element of the medieval battle. And because the gap between the romantic representation and the tactical reality is instructive about the broader gap between popular imagination and historical fact. The cavalry charge, the specific tactic of mounted knights at the gallop, in formation, striking an opposing force with the combined weight and momentum of horses and armored men, was the decisive battlefield instrument of much of the medieval period, from the Norman conquest of England in 1066, where William's cavalry broke the English shield wall at a critical moment, through the development of full-plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries. The heavy cavalry represented the most powerful single tactical element available to medieval commanders. The physics of a cavalry charge are impressive and worth understanding clearly. A destrier, the medieval war horse, a large, specialized animal bred and trained specifically for combat, weighed perhaps 600 to 900 kilograms. A fully armored knight on such a horse represented a combined mass of perhaps 700 to 1,000 kilograms. At the canter or gallop, this mass was moving at perhaps 25 to 40 kilometers per hour. The kinetic energy of this system, 1/2 of mass times velocity squared, is substantial, and the concentrated force of the lance point at the moment of impact represented a genuinely formidable physical threat to anything in its path. The formation mattered. A single horseman charging could be stepped aside from, surrounded, or cut down. A line of horsemen in tight formation, advancing together, presented a wall of horseflesh and steel that was extremely difficult to withstand if it struck a formation squarely. The specific psychological impact of several hundred horsemen in close formation advancing at speed, the noise, the vibration of the ground, the visual impression of an enormous mass of controlled violence approaching, was itself a tactical weapon, designed to break the psychological composure of defending infantry before physical contact was even made. The key word is if. The cavalry charge was devastatingly effective against infantry formations that broke, that ran, that lost their cohesion, that allowed the horses to find gaps in their defensive line, against infantry formations that kept their formation, that presented the horses with a wall of spear or pike points at exactly the height to deter approach. The cavalry charge often achieved considerably less than its theoretical potential. This is because horses are not weapons. They are animals with animal responses to threat. A horse that is galloping toward a wall of spear points will, in most circumstances, refuse the obstacle, will shy away, will slow, will try to go around. The war horses of the medieval period were specifically trained to continue in the face of noise, sudden movement, and the smell of blood, and this training was partially successful. Destriers were considerably more willing to approach threatening situations than untrained horses, but they were not robots. The horse that was faced with a sufficiently dense and sufficiently confident wall of pike points would not always press home the attack. This is why the psychological dimension of both the charge and the defense mattered so much. The defending infantry needed to maintain the appearance of confidence and cohesion, presenting a face to the advancing cavalry that suggested the position would hold, even when individual members of the formation were not actually confident. The moment at which the formation began to look uncertain, to drift backward, to show the gaps that a cavalry charge could exploit, was the moment of maximum danger. Conversely, the cavalry needed to commit to the charge fully and maintain momentum. Hesitation at the crucial moment was not simply a tactical failure, it was a psychological one that could break the attack entirely. The specific organization of cavalry in the medieval battle was not the undifferentiated mass of horsemen that romantic representation suggests. Medieval cavalry operated in tactical units, the conroy, in the terminology of the Norman and early medieval period, a group of roughly 10 to 20 knights who trained and operated together, who knew each other's capabilities and fighting styles, and who coordinated their actions through the specific signals and conventions of their shared military culture. The coordination of multiple conroys, the management of the cavalry as a whole, sequencing the commitment of different units to maximize tactical effect, holding reserves for exploitation of opportunities that developed during the battle, managing the physical and psychological exhaustion of horses and men over the course of a sustained engagement was one of the primary challenges of medieval command and one of the skills that distinguished effective commanders from ineffective ones. The horse's welfare was itself a significant military consideration. A destrier was an expensive, specialized animal representing a substantial portion of a knight's total financial value. The loss of a horse in combat was a serious financial setback, and a knight unhorsed in battle was a very different tactical proposition from a mounted knight. The man-at-arms who fought on foot in plate armor was still a formidable opponent, but he had lost the mobility, the psychological impact, and the physical mass of the mounted charge. He was also, unless he had immediate support from infantry around him, in significant tactical danger because a dismounted knight could be surrounded, overwhelmed by numbers, and attacked at his armor's vulnerabilities by opponents who had no need to face the horse that was no longer there. The specific vulnerability of horses to missile weapons, to arrows, to crossbow bolts, to thrown projectiles, was understood and exploited by medieval commanders who had access to effective missile weapons. The English tactic of positioning longbowmen to engage approaching cavalry in flank, shooting into the side of the cavalry formation where the horses had less armor protection, was spectacularly effective at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, not primarily because the arrows penetrated the knight's armor, but because they killed and wounded the horses, turning the devastating momentum of the cavalry charge into the specific chaos of men trying to extricate themselves from fallen, struggling animals while maintaining any tactical coherence. The aftermath of a cavalry charge, whether successful or repulsed, was a complex tactical situation that required immediate management. A successful charge that had broken through the enemy formation created a pursuing situation. Cavalry spread across the battlefield, pursuing broken infantry. That was tactically dangerous because the pursuing cavalry had lost their formation and their concentration and could be vulnerable to a counterattack by fresh reserves. Several medieval battles were decided not by the initial clash, but by the ability of one side to bring uncommitted forces to bear against cavalry that had overextended themselves in pursuit. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Scottish infantry under Robert Toole, the Bruce defeated a significantly larger English army, including a substantial cavalry element, illustrates this dynamic clearly. The Scottish Chiltern formations, dense blocks of spearmen, held their ground against cavalry charges with a discipline that denied the English cavalry the opportunity to exploit broken formations. When the English cavalry was repeatedly repulsed, the Scottish forces were able to advance and exploit the subsequent disorder, ultimately breaking the English army not through superior individual combat, but through the specific tactical virtue of maintaining formation discipline when the enemy's primary instrument had failed. Chapter 9. The Command. What medieval commanders actually did. You are a commander. Specifically, you are responsible for one side of a medieval battle, which means you are responsible for the specific decisions about formation, about timing, about the commitment of reserves, about the response to unexpected developments that will determine whether several thousand people live or die today, and whether your lord's political objectives are achieved or not. You have a horse, which gives you some mobility and some elevation. You have a staff of household knights who can carry your orders to the units of your army. You have a banner above you that marks your position and that your forces will look to for signals. You cannot see most of your battlefield. The dust, the distance, the sheer scale of the confusion that starts from the moment the armies engage means that the specific tactical picture, who is winning where, which formations are holding and which are breaking, where the opportunities for exploitation are, and where the crises requiring reinforcement are developing, is information that arrives at your position fragmentarily, delayed, and often inaccurate. This is one of the most consistent and most underappreciated realities of pre-modern command, the information problem. The commander who is responsible for making the decisions that would determine the battle's outcome typically knew less about the current state of the battle than a modern observer with good binoculars watching from a hill would know. His information came from messengers, the men on horseback who had been where the action was, who had observed what they could in the time available, and who were now delivering an account that was already out of date by the time it arrived. The messenger problem was not simply about the time delay, though that was significant. It was also about the accuracy and completeness of the information being transmitted. A messenger who had been near a section of the battle line and observed it briefly could accurately report what he had seen, but he had seen a limited slice of a complex situation, and his report was both inherently partial and colored by the specific perspective he had occupied. The commander, receiving multiple reports from different messengers, was assembling a picture of the battle from a set of partial, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory fragments. Medieval commanders developed specific strategies for managing this information problem. Some maintained personal positions with good observation, elevated ground, distance from the immediate fighting, that allowed them to observe as much of the battlefield as possible directly, rather than through messengers. Others stayed closer to the action, accepting worse overall situational awareness in exchange for better understanding of the immediate tactical situation. Most used some combination of personal observation and messenger reports, supplemented by the specific battlefield intelligence that their personal experience allowed them to interpret. The personal leadership role of the medieval commander is one of the aspects of medieval command most different from modern military command, and most consistent with the romantic image that popular history has preserved. Medieval commanders were expected to fight, personally visibly, in the front rank or close to it, in a way that inspired their forces and demonstrated the specific virtues that medieval military culture valorized. The commander who directed the battle from safety, who never personally exposed himself to the enemy, was subject to specific cultural criticism that had real consequences for his ability to maintain the loyalty and enthusiasm of his forces. This expectation of personal combat created a direct tension with the effective management of the battle. A commander who was personally engaged in combat, who was fighting with his sword against the men immediately in front of him, was not simultaneously observing the broader battlefield, issuing orders to distant units, managing his reserves, and making the broader tactical decisions that might determine the battle's outcome. The physical and cognitive demands of close combat were incompatible with the cognitive demands of battlefield command. Different medieval commanders managed this tension differently. Some, Richard III at Bosworth being a dramatic example, committed personally to the fighting at critical moments, with the tactical calculation that personal leadership at a specific point could change the local outcome and thereby affect the overall battle. This approach could work brilliantly. A commander's personal arrival at a crisis point could restore wavering troops, or fail catastrophically, as at Bosworth, where Richard's personal charge toward Henry Tudor exposed him without adequate support and resulted in his death and the collapse of his cause simultaneously. Others managed the tension by maintaining their command position while demonstrating enough personal courage through conspicuous proximity to danger to satisfy the cultural requirements without actually joining the hand-to-hand combat. The commander who positioned himself close enough to the fighting to be in range of missile fire, who was visibly present at the front of his forces without being in the melee, was threading the needle between the cultural requirement for personal bravery and the functional requirement for command capacity. The reserve was one of the most important command decisions in any medieval battle, and the management of it is one of the clearest indicators of the difference between competent and incompetent medieval commanders. A reserve, uncommitted forces held back from the initial engagement, provided the commander with a resource that could be deployed to exploit success or shore up failure as the battle developed. The premature commitment of the reserve, sending it in before the tactical situation made its deployment clearly advantageous, was one of the most common and most costly command errors. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 illustrates both sides of this. William's reserve, his cavalry, held back while the Norman infantry engaged the English shield wall, was committed at a specific tactical moment to exploit the gap created when the English fyrd broke formation to pursue what appeared to be a retreating Norman force. The timing of this commitment, after the English formation had been disrupted but before it could reform, was a genuine tactical accomplishment. By contrast, Harold's management of the English position, the decision to engage immediately with forces that had just completed a forced march from Yorkshire, reflected the kind of reserve management error that comes from not allowing exhausted troops adequate time to recover before committing them to battle. The commander's relationship with his subordinates, the lords and knights who commanded the component units of his army, was itself a complex political and military challenge. Medieval armies were not disciplined hierarchical organizations in which orders from the commander were automatically executed by the troops below. They were confederacies of more or less willing participants, each with their own interests, their own sense of honor, their own tactical preferences, and their own calculus of what was worth risking for the cause in question. The specific problem of managing noble subordinates who believed themselves entitled to independent tactical judgment, who might choose to charge when the commander wanted to hold, or hold when the commander needed aggression, was a consistent feature of medieval command, and the specific political relationships that gave the commander authority over those subordinates were negotiated before the battle through the complex social mechanisms of feudal obligation, personal loyalty, and the specific hierarchy of honor that medieval culture maintained. A commander whose authority over his forces was primarily political, who led a coalition of lords whose cooperation was the product of negotiated agreement rather than institutional discipline, had much less reliable control of his forces' tactical behavior than a commander whose authority was institutional and whose forces were trained to obedience. The French army at Agincourt in 1415, whose noble leadership consistently chose to show their contempt for the English position by attacking without adequate coordination, was exhibiting the specific dysfunction of an army in which individual honor took precedence over collective tactical effectiveness. Henry V at Agincourt, leading a disciplined, small, cohesive force whose institutional control was much tighter, whose units had been together long enough to develop the specific organizational trust that made coordinated action reliable, was exploiting exactly this vulnerability. Chapter 10: The Turning Point. How battles were actually decided. Medieval battles were rarely decided by the sustained attrition of two forces grinding against each other until one was physically destroyed. They were decided by moments, specific, often brief, often difficult to predict in advance, when the psychological equilibrium of one side tipped from resistance to collapse. The concept that modern military psychologists call breaking point, the specific moment at which a military unit transitions from fighting to fleeing, is one of the most important analytical tools for understanding medieval battlefield outcomes. The medieval battle was, at its core, a contest between the organized violence of two forces and the psychological willingness of those forces to sustain that violence in the face of its costs. The side that maintained its psychological organization, its collective willingness to keep fighting, longer than the other typically won, often regardless of the specific tactical balance at the moment of decision. This is why numerical superiority was less decisive in medieval warfare than simple arithmetic would suggest. A force that significantly outnumbered its opponent, but whose morale was fragile, could be broken by the shock of an unexpected development, a flank attack, the sudden appearance of reinforcements, the death of a leader whose presence was maintaining the army's psychological cohesion, at a moment when its numerical advantage was irrelevant. Conversely, a smaller force with tight organizational cohesion and high morale could sustain combat against a larger opponent long enough to either achieve their tactical objective or cause a disproportionate cost that broke the larger force's willingness to continue. The specific triggers that caused medieval armies to break were various and not always predictable. The death of the commander, particularly where the commander's personal presence was the primary source of the army's coherence, was one of the most reliable. The sudden appearance of unexpected forces, cavalry on a flank, infantry emerging from ambush, was another, because it disrupted the mental model of the battle that the soldiers were working from and created the specific uncertainty that panic exploits. The loss of the banner, the physical symbol of the commander's presence, and the organizational focal point of the army's identity, was a third, because in the visual chaos of the medieval battlefield, the banner was the primary signal that things were under control, and its disappearance meant they were not. The specific dynamics of the routed army, the army that had broken and was in the process of fleeing, are one of the least studied but most important aspects of medieval battle, because the rout was often when the actual killing happened. The medieval battle's casualty figures typically show a specific asymmetry, relatively modest losses on both sides during the fighting phase, and very large losses on the losing side during the rout. The reason for this asymmetry is mechanical. Men in formation, fighting together, provided mutual support and protection. Men who had broken formation and were running, individually and without coordination, presented exactly the kind of target that cavalry pursuit was most effective at exploiting. The Agincourt casualty figures make this asymmetry vivid. The English forces suffered perhaps 100 to 300 killed during the battle itself. The French losses, principally occurring in the confused melee and in the killing of prisoners described earlier, amounted to several thousand dead. These numbers are disputed in their specifics, but the ratio is broadly supported by the surviving evidence and by the consistent pattern of other medieval battles. The victors' losses were typically a small fraction of the losers, because the most dangerous phase of the battle for the losers was not the fighting but the pursuit. the specific decision of whether to pursue a broken enemy and how far and with what forces was one of the most consequential command decisions in any medieval battle. An aggressive pursuit maximized the damage done to the broken enemy and potentially prevented their reorganization and return, but a pursuit that extended too far, that committed forces beyond the ability of the commander to recall them, left the battlefield itself and the commander's remaining forces potentially vulnerable to unexpected threats. The Battle of Noseby in 1645, technically outside the medieval period but illustrating the same dynamic, shows what happened when cavalry pursuers followed a rooting enemy off the battlefield and out of the battle. Prince Rupert's cavalry, after successfully routing the parliamentary cavalry opposite them, continued in pursuit for miles, while the royalist infantry in the center of the battle were defeated. Rupert's cavalry returned to find the battle decided against them, their pursuit having removed them from the critical moment. The medieval route also had specific geographic dimensions. The terrain between the battlefield and safety, the rivers, the forests, the roads, the distance from one's own territory, determined what happened to soldiers who were trying to escape. The Battle of the Spurs in 1513, named for the speed with which the French cavalry fled rather than fought, resulted in large numbers of French prisoners taken as they were overtaken by English and Habsburg cavalry. The Battle of Bosworth resulted in the relatively small number of casualties on Richard III's side, other than Richard himself, because Richard's death collapsed his army's will to fight before the pursuit could develop. The topography of the battlefield mattered in the route as much as in the advance. A retreating army that had a river behind it was in a different tactical situation from one with open country at its back. The Battle of Flodden in 1513, where Scottish forces were cut off from their line of retreat by the English forces' successful flanking movement, resulted in very high Scottish casualties, precisely because the tactical situation of the broken Scottish formation left its members without viable escape routes. Chapter 11: The Prisoners, Ransom, Mercy, and the Economics of Captivity. You have been defeated, or not killed, which is itself a specific outcome worth examining, but defeated. The man who was fighting you has your sword arm pinned, his knife at the gap in your armor at the throat, and he is saying something in a language or accent you can barely understand, but whose meaning is entirely clear. Surrender or die. You surrender. The taking of prisoners in medieval warfare was not simply a humanitarian impulse, though the chivalric tradition did include genuine ethical injunctions against the killing of opponents who had offered surrender. It was an economic system, one of the primary financial incentives of medieval warfare, structured around the practice of ransom that made the capture of valuable opponents one of the most profitable possible outcomes of a successful battle. The ransom system worked as follows. A captured knight or nobleman was held prisoner by his captor until his family, lord, or political associates paid a specified sum for his release. The sum was negotiated, typically expressed as a multiple of the prisoner's annual income, reflecting the medieval understanding that the appropriate ransom should be ruinous enough to be meaningful, but not so large as to be impossible. And the prisoner was typically paroled to collect the ransom, traveling on his word of honor to secure the funds and return. The financial scale of the ransom system can be illustrated by a few specific examples. The ransom of King Richard I of England, captured by Duke Leopold of Austria in 1192, was set at 150,000 marks, approximately 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown. Raising this ransom was an enormous national effort that required the taxation of the entire English population and the liquidation of significant royal assets. The ransom of King John II of France, captured at Poitiers in 1356, was set at 3 million gold écus, a sum so large that John was never fully ransomed, returning to English captivity voluntarily when his son, who had been given as a hostage in his place, escaped. At the level of ordinary knights and men-at-arms, the ransom system was a consistent financial feature of military life. The knight who captured a valuable prisoner, a lord, a rich knight, a high-ranking officer, could expect a financial windfall that might exceed his annual income by a significant multiple. The specific art of identifying valuable prisoners, recognizing the heraldic marks of wealth and rank in the confusion of combat, was a genuine skill that experienced soldiers developed. The ransom system created specific behaviors in combat that would otherwise seem irrational. The decision to capture rather than kill a valuable opponent, accepting the short-term tactical cost of managing a prisoner in exchange for the long-term financial benefit of the ransom, was a rational calculation in the context of the system. The specific protocols of surrender, the formal declaration of quarter, the removal of weapons, the binding of the prisoner, were conventions that both parties had interests in maintaining because they made the system work. The system was not universal. It applied primarily to participants in the chivalric system, knights and nobles, who were recognized members of the social order within which the ransom conventions operated. Common soldiers, foot soldiers, archers, men-at-arms, without significant wealth or status, were not typically worth ransoming and were therefore in a significantly more dangerous position when captured. The medieval battle's mercy was stratified by social class. The wealthy and the well-born could expect to be captured and held for ransom. The common soldier could expect to be killed if defeated. This asymmetry was not merely cynical. It reflected the specific economic logic of the ransom system. You only keep what you can profitably exchange, and the specific constraints of military logistics. Managing large numbers of common prisoners was expensive and practically difficult. The practical default for opponents who were not worth ransoming was usually killing, and the specific cultural rationalizations for this killing. The enemy was not a recognized member of the chivalric order. The enemy had fought without proper military status. The enemy had committed specific violations of the laws of war, were more readily available when the calculation was financially convenient. The killing of prisoners during or after a battle was not invariably a violation of the laws of war in the medieval understanding. Specific circumstances, the resumption of fighting by opponents who had surrendered, the tactical emergency that made prisoner management impossible, the deliberate punishment of opponents who had conducted the war in ways that violated accepted conventions, provided justifications for killing prisoners that medieval military culture recognized as at least plausible. The specific order by Henry V at Agincourt to kill the prisoners, an order that was carried out by the English men-at-arms with what the sources suggest was considerable reluctance given the financial value they were destroying, was justified by the tactical emergency of a French force appearing to be advancing on the English rear. Whether this threat was real or perceived, whether the order was proportionate to the threat, and what the specific moral status of the order was in the context of medieval military ethics are questions that historians have been arguing about for 600 years and have not resolved. The treatment of prisoners in the period of captivity between capture and ransom payment varied considerably. High-status prisoners were typically held in comfortable conditions, housed in the castles or manors of their captors, free to move within specified limits on their parole. sometimes joining the social life of their captor's household. The chronicler Froissart describes the captured French knights at Poitiers being hosted to dinner by the Black Prince with a courtesy that reads as genuinely collegial rather than merely tactical. The shared culture of chivalry creating a specific social bond between captor and prisoner that transcended the immediate military relationship. Lower status prisoners who had been taken for what value they might have. The ransomable minor knight, the sergeant whose equipment suggested some resources, were held in less comfortable conditions, sometimes in actual confinement, sometimes in the less pleasant form of parole that allowed movement but required the prisoner to report regularly and remain accessible. The specific legal and cultural framework governing the treatment of prisoners was one of the areas where the laws of war, the specific conventions that limited what was permissible in the conduct of medieval warfare, were most consistently articulated and most consistently observed, because both sides had direct financial interest in maintaining the system. A captor who mistreated his prisoner was not simply behaving dishonorably. He was potentially damaging his property. A prisoner who died in captivity before the ransom was paid generated no income. Chapter 12. The aftermath. The field after the battle. The battle is over. Whatever the outcome, whoever has won, whoever has fled, however many dead are lying in the field between where the two armies formed this morning. The specific event of the battle itself has concluded. And now begins a phase of the medieval military experience that popular history almost entirely ignores, and that was, in many respects, as consequential as the battle itself. The field of battle in the hours and days after the fighting was a specific kind of landscape that has no precise modern equivalent. It was an enormous outdoor hospital, an improvised morgue, a salvage operation, a negotiation site, and a burial ground simultaneously. The living wounded who lay in the field were the most urgent concern, but most urgent concern is a relative term. In a world without ambulances, without organized medical evacuation, without the specific institutional infrastructure that modern armies deploy to manage the post-battle casualty situation. The wounded who could be reached and identified were collected by the victorious army's servants and camp followers, whose immediate task was to identify the living from the dead and to provide whatever first aid the situation allowed. Wounds were bound with whatever clean cloth was available. Arrows were extracted with the specific techniques that the better trained wound dressers knew. Bones were set where setting was possible. The seriously wounded who could not move and who were not, immediately accessible to help faced a grimmer situation. The medieval battlefield's triage was not the organized system of modern emergency medicine. It was the immediate calculation of who was reachable, who was identifiable as worth helping, and what resources were available to help them. The common soldier with a belly wound, lying in the mud of the field, far from where the victorious forces were collecting their own casualties, might lie there for hours or days before someone reached him, or might not be reached at all. The stripping of the dead was one of the first organized activities on a medieval battlefield after the fighting concluded. Armor, weapons, and personal valuables represented enormous financial value. A full harness of plate armor was worth several months' wages for a skilled craftsman, and the battlefield was covered with armor, weapons, horses, and personal goods that had belonged to the dead. The stripping of the battlefield was an economic activity of significance sufficient that it was organized and contested. The right to strip specific individuals was a matter of property, bound up with the ransom system and the specific claims that individual captors had established over specific individuals. The camp followers who moved onto the battlefield after the fighting, who had a reputation in medieval military culture for ruthless efficiency and occasionally for finishing off the seriously wounded to accelerate the stripping process, were performing a specific economic function that the military system depended on and simultaneously deplored. The practical reality was that large numbers of people who had invested their labor and their capital in the campaign had a legitimate financial interest in the spoils of the battlefield, and the aftermath of a major victory was one of the primary occasions on which that investment could be recouped. The identification of the dead was a logistical challenge of the first order in an army of thousands, many of whom the surviving commanders knew personally. The identification of specific individuals from among the dead was necessary, both for the practical management of the aftermath, determining who was dead and who was captured, settling the disposition of estates and feudal obligations, and for the emotional and religious requirements of proper burial. The heraldic system served this function as much as any other. The specific visual identification of knights and lords through their personal heraldic marks allowed the heralds to identify the dead on the battlefield and compile the specific list of dead and captured that were necessary for the post-battle administrative processes. The herald's role in the battle's aftermath, moving among the dead, recording identities, compiling the casualty list that would eventually become the official record of the battle's outcome, was one of the specific functions that made the herald's cross-factional immunity genuinely useful. The burial of the dead was managed according to a specific hierarchy. High-status dead, lords, and knights were typically embalmed where possible, their bodies prepared for transport back to their home territories for burial in family chapels and churches. The embalming process available in the medieval period, evisceration, packing with salt, wrapping in hides, was imperfect, and the distance that bodies could be transported before decomposition made further transport impractical. Set a practical limit on the geographical extent of this honor. Common soldiers were buried in mass graves near the battlefield, graves of the type that archaeology has found and studied at Visby, at Towton, at Fornham, and at other medieval battle sites across Europe. These graves were not marked in the way that individual burials were marked. They were the functional disposal of large numbers of bodies in the most practical available way, dug quickly to address the immediate sanitary problem of large numbers of decomposing bodies in warm weather, and to provide the minimal religious observances that Christian practice required. The specific religious requirements of Christian burial, the last rites, the blessing of the grave, the prayers for the souls of the dead, were provided as far as the available clergy could manage. The battlefield clergy, the chaplains who had accompanied the army, had, in the aftermath of a major battle, an enormous pastoral task: the administration of last rites to the dying, the blessing of the mass graves, the prayers for the dead, and the management of the living soldiers' grief and psychological response to what they had experienced. The specific psychological aftermath of medieval battle, what happened in the minds of the men who had participated, is one of the most difficult aspects of the experience to access from historical sources. The medieval vocabulary for what we now call combat stress, trauma, and psychological injury from violence was different from modern vocabulary and embedded in different conceptual frameworks. The symptoms that modern military psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress responses, nightmares, intrusive memories, hyperarousal, emotional numbing, were experienced by medieval soldiers, but interpreted through the frameworks available to them. Religious experience, moral accounting, the specific emotional processing that medieval culture associated with violence and death. The confession the sacramental acknowledgement of sin, provided a specific and regular mechanism for the emotional and moral processing of the combat experience. The medieval soldier who had killed in battle was required to confess this killing and to perform the penance that the priest specified, even when the killing had been entirely legitimate by the standards of just war theory. This requirement was not merely theological. It was a psychological practice that forced a specific cognitive processing of the combat experience, a naming, an acknowledgement, a formal closure that served some of the same functions that modern trauma-focused therapy attempts to serve through more elaborate means. The specific integration of violent experience into the broader narrative of a medieval life. Through storytelling, through the public recognition of valor in battle that chivalric culture provided, through the specific honor that surviving significant combat conferred, was another dimension of the psychological aftermath management that medieval culture had developed, not explicitly as therapy, but functionally serving that purpose. Chapter 13. The Siege. When battles weren't enough, you are looking at a wall. Specifically, you are looking at the wall of a castle from a distance of approximately 300 meters, which is close enough to appreciate the problem, and far enough to avoid the arrows of the people on top of it who would very much like you to go away. The wall is approximately 10 meters high. The stone is solid limestone, perhaps 2 meters thick at the base. At regular intervals, towers project from the wall face, allowing the defenders to shoot along the wall's exterior surface, to cover in military terminology what the builders called the dead ground at the base. There is a ditch in front of the wall, filled with water. Behind the outer wall is an inner wall, higher still. You have an army. You have siege engines. You have somewhere in your supply train the components of a trebuchet capable of throwing a 100-kilogram stone projectile approximately 200 meters with enough force to do serious damage to anything it hits. You have miners who know how to dig tunnels under walls. You have carpenters who can build siege towers. You have, in theory, everything you need. What you also have is a problem that no amount of equipment entirely solves: time. The siege was the dominant form of medieval warfare. More medieval military campaigns were decided by sieges than by pitched battles, for the simple reason that most military objectives, the control of territory, the suppression of opposition, the enforcement of political authority, were embodied in specific fortified places that could not be controlled without being taken. The castle, the fortified town, the walled monastery that happened to sit on a strategically critical road junction. These were the chess pieces of medieval military strategy, and the ability to take them was the fundamental military capability that determined strategic outcomes. The pitched battle, by contrast, was an event that experienced medieval commanders tried to avoid unless the tactical conditions strongly favored them. A battle was a single decisive event in which chance played a significant role, and in which a strategically superior position could be destroyed in an afternoon by an unlucky combination of weather, terrain, and tactical miscalculation. The siege was slower, more expensive, more exhausting for everyone involved, but it was also more controllable. The outcome of a competently conducted siege against a castle without external relief was eventually inevitable. The wall came down, or the food ran out, or both. This is why, when medieval chroniclers and modern historians count up the actual military engagements of any extended medieval campaign, the sieges outnumber the pitched battles by ratios of 10 to 1 or more. The famous battles, Hastings, Crecy, Agincourt, Bosworth, are famous precisely because they were exceptional. They were the moments when the dominant form of medieval warfare, the slow, grinding, logistically demanding business of siege, was bypassed by the dramatic event of the open field engagement. The mechanics of the siege involved a specific set of techniques and counter-techniques that evolved in a continuous arms race between attackers and defenders across the entire medieval period. The development of the stone castle, from the simple motte and bailey earthwork of the Norman period to the concentric stone fortifications of the 13th century, was itself a response to the improving capabilities of attackers. And the development of siege technique was in turn a response to the improving capabilities of the fortifications. The trebuchet, the counterweight-powered throwing machine that was the most powerful siege engine of the high medieval period, could throw projectiles heavy enough to damage masonry walls with sustained bombardment. A well-made trebuchet with a heavy counterweight could throw a stone of 100 to 150 kilograms on a trajectory that dropped it nearly vertically onto the wall's top surface, chipping the crenellations, breaking the walkways, gradually degrading the ability of the defenders to use the wall as a fighting platform. The key word is gradually. The trebuchet was not a wall-breaching weapon in the way that later gunpowder artillery would prove to be. It was an attrition weapon, degrading the defensive position over time, making life on the wall miserable and progressively less viable. Combined with other siege methods, the mine, the ram, the siege tower, it was part of an integrated approach to fortress reduction that required patience, resources, and time. The mine was arguably the most technically demanding of the siege techniques, and in the right conditions, the most effective at achieving rapid results. Medieval siege miners, specialist soldiers with expertise in tunneling, would dig a tunnel under the foundation of the targeted wall section, propping the tunnel with timber as they went. When the tunnel reached the foundation, they would pack the end of the tunnel with combustible material, typically wood and fat, and set it alight before retreating. The burning supports would give way, the tunnel would collapse, and the section of wall above it would lose its foundation and fall. The countermeasure was undermining the undermining. Defenders who suspected a mine was being dug would try to locate it through the specific technique of placing bowls of water on the ground and watching for the surface disturbance caused by underground digging. They would then attempt to intercept the mine with a countermine, collapsing the attacker's tunnel before it reached the wall, or engaging the miners directly in the specific claustrophobic horror of underground combat. The siege tower, the tall timber structure built to match the height of the defensive wall, pushed forward on wheels or rollers, was the attacker's attempt to provide a fighting platform that equalized the height advantage of the defenders. A siege tower allowed attackers to bring their own missile weapons to bear at the wall's level, suppressing the defenders while the tower was pushed into contact with the wall, and the assault bridge at the tower's top was dropped onto the wall walk. The defenders' countermeasures against the siege tower were various, burning the tower with incendiary materials thrown from the wall, undermining the ground in front of the wall so that the tower's approach was obstructed, building additional height onto the wall section being approached to maintain the height advantage. The specific detail that the wheels or rollers of a siege tower had to travel across ground that the defenders had deliberately broken up, flooded, or mined with obstacles is one of the practical realities of siege warfare that the romantic representations consistently omit. The garrison's experience of being besieged was one of the more specific forms of extended misery that the medieval world offered. A castle garrison, typically a relatively small number of men-at-arms and their servants, was confined to a shrinking space with diminishing resources, under continuous psychological pressure from the knowledge that the army outside was getting larger as relief failed to materialize, and that the wall between them was being systematically attacked. The specific anxieties of the siege, the daily assessment of the food stores, the management of the water supply in a drought, the question of what the Lord outside was offering to the garrison's commander in exchange for surrender, were the psychological texture of an experience that could last weeks, months, or in the most extreme cases, years. The social dynamics of the garrison under extended siege were themselves interesting. The castle's constable, the military governor responsible for its defense, had specific legal obligations to the Lord who had entrusted the castle to his care. He was expected to hold the castle until it was genuinely indefensible or until it was relieved by his lord's forces. Surrendering a defensible castle was not simply a practical decision. It was a breach of feudal obligation that carried real social consequences. The constable who surrendered a castle that could have held longer was subject to criticism, legal action, and the specific reputational damage that medieval military culture associated with failure of duty. The protocols of surrender, the formal processes by which a garrison could offer and a besieger could accept the capitulation of a fortress, were among the most elaborated of medieval military conventions, precisely because both sides had interests in making them work. The garrison that surrendered before being breached typically received better terms than the garrison that held until the wall fell, and was then at the mercy of the attacker's immediate reaction. The specific convention of the hail, the formal offer of surrender made before a practicable breach had been made, was recognized in medieval military law as a point at which the besieging commander was obligated to accept reasonable terms rather than simply pressing the assault. The castle whose garrison held beyond the point where the wall was practicably breached, forcing the besiegers to actually assault through the breach, with the casualties that a defended breach imposed on the attackers, forfeited, in the medieval understanding, its claim to quarter. The sack of a castle taken by assault was not a violation of the laws of war in the medieval framework. It was the recognized consequence of resistance to the point where the breach was forced. This convention, and the specific violence it authorized, is one of the clearest illustrations of how medieval military conventions operated not as pure humanitarianism, but as a system of incentives and consequences designed to manage the costs of siege warfare for both parties. Chapter 14: The Mercenary, when war became a profession. You're not fighting for your lord. You're not fighting for the specific community of obligation and loyalty that the feudal system created. You are not fighting because you owe 40 days of military service in exchange for your land tenure, and those 40 days have been called. You are fighting because you are being paid. You are a professional in the specific sense that your military service is a commercial transaction, and the terms of that transaction, the wage, the duration, the specific obligations on both sides, are matters of contract rather than feudal obligation. You are a mercenary. And in the later medieval period, you are also the dominant military reality. The emergence of professional paid soldiers as the primary military instrument of medieval warfare is one of the most significant developments of the 13th and 14th centuries, and it is one that the popular image of medieval warfare, dominated by feudal knights and their obligated retinues, almost entirely misses. The transition from feudal levy to paid professional military force was not a single event, but a gradual process driven by specific practical realities that made the feudal system increasingly inadequate for the demands of sustained medieval warfare. The 40-day limit of the feudal obligation was the most fundamental structural problem. Medieval military campaigns rarely concluded within 40 days. A siege could last months. A campaign to suppress rebellion in a distant province could require forces to be maintained in the field for an entire campaigning season. The feudal levy, which dispersed after 40 days regardless of the campaign state, was functionally useless for extended operations. Medieval commanders who wanted to maintain forces in the field beyond the feudal obligation limit had to pay. The transition to paid military service was, at its core, the rational response to a structural mismatch between the feudal obligation system and the actual demands of medieval warfare. The mercenary companies that emerged as the solution to this problem were sophisticated military organizations that bore very little relationship to the popular image of mercenaries as undisciplined violence for hire. The great mercenary companies of the 14th century, the White Company in Italy, associated with the English captain Sir John Hawkwood, the various routier companies that terrorized France during the lulls in the 100 Years' War, the Swiss Confederate forces that became the most sought-after professional infantry in Europe, were highly organized, tactically disciplined, and militarily effective organizations whose services were in continuous demand precisely because they delivered what they promised. Sir John Hawkwood, the Essex-born archer who became the most celebrated military commander in 14th century Italy, leading the White Company through decades of campaigns for various Italian city-states, was not a brigand who happened to have a company of soldiers. He was a sophisticated military entrepreneur who managed a complex organization, negotiated contracts with wealthy and demanding clients, maintained the internal discipline of a large force of professional soldiers, and delivered military results that justified the considerable expense of his services. His tomb in Florence Cathedral, where the Florentines honored him with a magnificent fresco by Paolo Uccello after his death, reflects the genuine prestige that effective military professionalism commanded in the later medieval world. The Swiss infantry, the pike-armed foot soldiers from the Swiss Confederacy who dominated the military market of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, represent the most extreme development of the mercenary system in the medieval period. The Swiss cantons organized the export of military labor as a deliberate economic policy. Young Swiss men served in foreign armies for wages that their agricultural economy could not provide. The specific military effectiveness of Swiss infantry, their extraordinary discipline, their aggressive tactical doctrine, their willingness to close with the enemy without the hesitation that characterized many other infantry forces, made them the most valuable and most expensive military commodity in Europe, and the specific financial returns from Swiss military service were substantial enough to be a significant component of the Confederate economy. The domestically destabilizing consequences of the mercenary system were also real and extensively documented. The companies of routiers that devastated the French countryside during the periods of truce in the 100 Years' War. Professional soldiers who had no current employer and whose skills were exclusively military, who lived off the land with the specific thoroughness of people who knew how to extract resources from a civilian population efficiently, represented one of the most serious law and order problems of the 14th century French monarchy. The specific efforts to redirect these companies, to give them a war to fight somewhere else, to sign them on for a crusade, to negotiate, their dispersal, occupied French royal policy for decades. The mercenaries' relationship to the social and cultural values of the chivalric tradition was ambiguous and contested. The knight who fought for wages rather than honor was not, in the chivalric framework, quite the same thing as the knight who fought for his lord out of obligation and loyalty. The mercenary's motivation was explicitly commercial, and commercial motivation was, in the medieval hierarchy of values, lower than the motivations of honor, loyalty, and religious duty that the chivalric framework privileged. Yet the most celebrated mercenary commanders of the period, Hawkwood, Du Guesclin, Roger de Flor, were simultaneously celebrated for their military virtue in terms that the chivalric tradition would recognize. The contradiction was managed by emphasizing the martial skill and personal courage of the mercenary commander, while tactfully not dwelling on the commercial basis of his service. The tournament circuit, the organized military competition that had developed in the 12th century as a training ground for mounted combat, was itself partly a mercenary market. The tournament was not merely sport and not merely social display. It was a venue in which military reputation was made and demonstrated, in which lords assessed the capabilities of potential military contractors, and in which successful fighters could capture opponents for ransoms that functioned essentially as a professional income. The transition from the tournament as feudal military training to the tournament as commercial spectacle and reputation market tracks the broader transition from feudal to professional military organization. Chapter 15: The Cost. What war did to medieval society. Medieval warfare was not cheap. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, that the popular representation consistently obscures. The cinematic medieval battle has no budget problem. The armies appear fully equipped and logistically supported from nowhere. They fight, they disperse. The economic dimension of all of this, the enormous financial cost of raising, equipping, maintaining, and demobilizing a medieval army is invisible. The actual economics of medieval warfare were the dominant political reality of the medieval period in a way that cannot be overstated. The ability to wage war, to raise armies, to fund campaigns, to maintain fortifications, to pay the professionals whose services were increasingly essential, required resources that individual lords and even kingdoms often did not have without extraordinary measures. The specific financial mechanisms through which medieval rulers attempted to fund their military ambitions drove some of the most significant political and institutional developments of the period. The English Parliament emerged in its essential form from the financial requirements of Edward I's sustained military campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and France in the late 13th century. Edward needed money, more money than the normal revenues of the English crown could provide, and getting that money required the negotiated consent of the communities that would be taxed. The specific institutional form that this negotiation took, the assembly of representatives of the commons alongside the lords, the exchange of supply for redress of grievances, was shaped by the military financial crisis of a king who was waging simultaneous wars on multiple fronts. The 100 Years' War between England and France, technically a series of conflicts from 1337 to 1453, was simultaneously a military, political, and economic phenomenon whose financial dimensions were as significant as its tactical ones. The specific pattern of the war, periods of intense English military success followed by French recovery, the eventual French reconquest of English-held territories, reflects not simply the military balance, but the specific financial sustainability of each side's war effort and the specific ability of each side's political institutions to maintain the taxation required to sustain armies in the field. The cost to the civilian population of the territory where medieval warfare took place was one of the most consequential but least visible aspects of the medieval military experience. The peasant farming family whose crops were seized to feed a passing army, whose village was burned by troops exercising the specific punitive logic of the chevauchée, whose male members had been killed or impressed, whose agricultural capital, the animals, the tools, the stored grain, had been stripped. This family does not appear in the military chronicles, whose authors were writing about commanders and knights and the specific events of battles and campaigns. The chevauchée, the deliberate raid through enemy territory, designed to destroy agricultural capacity, demonstrate the inability of the opposing lord to protect his people and generate the financial pressure of damaged tax revenues, was a recognized strategic instrument of medieval warfare that directly targeted the civilian economic base. The specific campaigns of the Black Prince in France during the 1350s and 1360s, which devastated enormous areas of the French countryside in exactly this way, were not aberrations from normal military conduct. They were the deliberate application of a recognized strategy that medieval military theory treated as legitimate. The demographic impact of sustained medieval warfare on the populations that experienced it is difficult to quantify, precisely because the specific combination of direct military violence, famine resulting from agricultural disruption, and disease spreading through displaced and malnourished populations does not decompose cleanly into its components in the historical record. What is clear is that areas of sustained military activity, northern France during the 100 Years' War, the border regions of England and Scotland during the Wars of Independence, the Italian city-state territories during the Condottiere period, experienced significant population decline and economic disruption that extended far beyond the immediate impact of any specific military engagement. The specific relationship between medieval warfare and disease is one of the areas where the military and medical histories most powerfully intersect. Large concentrations of people in poor sanitary conditions, the army camp, the besieged city, the refugee population displaced by military activity, provided ideal conditions for the spread of infectious disease. The specific disease history of medieval military campaigns is a record of armies destroyed by dysentery, typhus, and various unspecified fevers, at least as frequently as they were destroyed by enemy action. The crusading armies that set out from Western Europe with such military ambition and returned in such diminished form were typically suffering from the specific combination of unfamiliar disease environments, disrupted supply leading to malnutrition, and the accumulated physical wear of years of campaigning. The economic recovery from extended medieval warfare was slow and uneven. Agricultural land left uncultivated because the farmers were dead, displaced, or too reduced in resources to cultivate it, reverted to scrub over a period of years. Livestock populations stripped to feed armies required years to rebuild. The specific human capital of craft skills and agricultural knowledge disrupted by the death or displacement of practitioners took a generation or more to fully restore. The specific psychological capital of communities whose social fabric had been torn by years of violence and disruption took longer still. Conclusion: you are still standing in that field. The dew has dried. The sun has moved. The armies that were here this morning are gone. Some marching to their next objective, some marching home, some never marching anywhere again. The field itself is being cleaned in the specific way that medieval fields were cleaned after battles, stripped of everything valuable, the dead buried in the long trenches that the grave diggers have been digging since mid-afternoon, the horses that could be saved led away. the horses that could not dragged to the edges of the field. By next spring, crops will grow here again. The specific fertility that large numbers of dead bodies contribute to agricultural soil is not something the chronicles mention, but the farmers who came back to these fields the following season knew it. The land remembered, in its own way, what had happened here. You have spent the last several hours understanding something that most people never think about when they think about medieval warfare. That the battles were the exception. The march was the norm. The logistics were the reality. The waiting was the experience. The route, not the advance, was when most of the dying happened. The prisoners were assets, not charity cases. The chivalric ideal was a standard that everyone aspired to, and almost nobody consistently achieved. The cost fell most heavily on the people who appear least often in the chronicles. Medieval warfare was not a tournament writ large. It was not a canvas for individual heroism, not a stage for the performance of martial virtue, not the simplified contest between good and evil that the romances describe and the films depict. It was a specific human institution embedded in a specific economic and political system, conducted by specific people with specific motivations and specific fears and specific limitations, producing outcomes that were determined as much by the mundane realities of wet boots and insufficient food, and the specific social dynamics of frightened men, trying not to show it as by any grand tactical or strategic design. The people who fought medieval battles were not heroes or villains. They were human beings doing something that human beings have always done. Organizing themselves for violence in the service of political objectives, trying to survive the process, trying to make sense of what they had done afterward, trying to find the moral language that would allow them to live with it. They were, in the most important sense, exactly like us. The weapons were different. The armor was different. The specific political objectives were different. The cultural frameworks, chivalry, feudal obligation, the specific theology of the just war, were different from the frameworks that modern military institutions use to make sense of the same fundamental activity. But the fear was the same. The social solidarity was the same. The impulse to construct moral frameworks for organized violence was the same. The gap between the ideal and the reality was the same, and the specific, ordinary, slightly embarrassing human courage of standing in a cold, wet field at dawn, waiting for something terrible to happen, trying not to let the men around you see how frightened you are. That was the same too. It always is.